Welcome to the Pulse Podcast, Living Abundantly, Wholeheartedly. I'm your host, Matthew Rattan. Since a pulse doesn't mean you're alive, this podcast is about the vitality of firm faith, pursuing personal integrity, and consistently keeping the main thing in practical ways, day by day. In this podcast, there are interviews, weekly biblical studies, and also featured talks. This episode is a category of the latter. At the church I pastor, Westminster in Barrie, Canada, we sometimes have something called a Q&A forum. People submit questions ahead of time, and after a worship service, I provide an answer. Since I get a decent amount of questions, the answer I give to one person might be helpful to more. My approach is this: I try to answer questions through the lens of another. What does God wisely teach us through the Bible? Now, I'm not God, obviously, therefore I don't know everything, and people are free to disagree with me, but I do my best to provide us with some biblical things to consider. This was originally recorded live on June 13th, 2021. Is it just me, or is the world getting more argumentative? Thoughts from a biblical perspective. And this is anonymous. So thank you for the question. Let me just say that I get it. It does sometimes seem like the world and our society in general is maybe getting more argumentative. And by argumentative, I assume that you mean prone to arguing, maybe even quick to argue, perhaps even a strange delight in doing that. The question also asked me to share some thoughts from a biblical perspective, so I'll definitely do that. So I'm going to approach this from a pastoral perspective because I think the reason for that is because the tensions or argumentativeness of our world can be tiring, can't it? It can be tiring. So maybe this question's from a place of personal weariness in the question, so I want to address that. But also at the same time, it can be a temptation to be argumentative and to get sucked into this way of discourse, which is becoming increasingly common. So first, I can't really say whether or not the world is getting more argumentative. I don't know how you quantify that data, but I will say that we have more information coming at us than ever before. So part of the reason it might seem like the world is getting more argumentative is because we are hearing nonstop information and news. And the way that news gets presented to us is to present one side of the story, then often another side of the story, and often gets set up, and this is my observation, in a way that is presented to us with opposing views that are almost hostile. It's like a combat narrative, almost. I'm not saying all of it's like that, but sometimes you kind of have to do the work. I remember one time I'm working at Queen's Park, and there was this government initiative, and it was just a win. Like every major political party agreed that it was a good idea. Good for local economy, good for the environment. Liberals, Tories, NDP all agreed upon it. Great, this is a win. And I remember this one reporter who went out like looking for stakeholders who didn't even know what was going on to try to tell them what was happening, to get them to say something negative. And the next day the story was, well, Queen's Park made some announcement, but not everyone's happy. Like it just didn't really represent the reality. But and again, it doesn't always happen like that, but sometimes the ways news can be presented is a bit of a challenge. Why is that? Perhaps argument or combat narrative sell, I don't know. And there's other bigger cultural things happening about all that, but let's go on. Second, the internet, and particularly social media, has introduced the ability for us to respond to things in real time. And so if I see something that upsets me, I can post something immediately for thousands of people to see. The same is true for politicians, prime ministers, celebrities, your friends, whoever. And so we have lost the art of sober second thought. Sober second thought. And so here's one of the reasons that is a problem. Your first reaction isn't always your best response. Your first reaction isn't always your best response. Third, and I think there's also something happening in our society broadly where we are less able to respect and get along with people who disagree with us. So I think, and this is my own kind of cultural observation, I think a dream for Canada is to a certain degree today, the idea of diversity and tolerance. And it was the case where people could really actually have fundamental disagreements about serious things and believe different things and still respect each other and stand alongside each other in the process. But today it seems to me there is a shift happening where we can talk about those things, but it's almost become this watered down idea where, if you don't agree with certain things, you're kind of
the argument quickly becomes polarized and you get labeled as evil or something. There's this real quickness because of the information, because of the online real-time things happening, that it becomes divisive and breaks off conversation before it needs to be broken off. So that's a whole big topic, and it's hard for people to have real differences, and I think we're kind of losing some maturity as a society because of that, and it's to do with cancel culture and everything else. But having said all that, with that in mind, some biblical things. The world has always been full of sin, and we need to remember that. And it still is full of sin. Sin, as we talked about during the kids' time today, is breaking God's laws and teachings. And because of that, I'm never surprised at argumentativeness. I may be disappointed. I may be saddened. I'm not surprised. It's a part of the culture in which we live. Quite often we're surprised when bad things happen because instead of remembering that the world is and people have this sin and we are fundamentally sinful, if we forget that and think, well, we're all fundamentally good, basically, then we're always going to continue to be let down. So I think that might be part of it as well. In Matthew 24:12, Jesus, speaking about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, also about end times generally, speaks of the increase of wickedness and the love of most growing cold. And so this can be interpreted to mean that, unfortunately, for the time being, breaking God's laws, engaging in sinful behavior is a part of our world. Not great, but what do? We remember who we are and who we are called to be. We are to be salt and light, which means that we are to share the light of Jesus and to serve as a preservative of his godliness in the world. The cardinal virtue is humility. It's named consistently in virtue lists, especially in the New Testament. 1 Peter 5:5, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. It's a high calling, it's difficult, impossible without God's help, but it's who we are called to be. B, disengage from the insanity. Nonstop news, nonstop phone checking, nonstop internet, nonstop posting and comments without sober second thought is not helpful. And it fatigues your brain in ways beyond our knowing and in ways which psychologists will be studying for years to come. C, love is a decision. Hostility is a reaction. And so when you do engage in conversation and dialogue with issues and people in our world, don't do it to be right, but to be loving. Ask yourself, how is my approach to this issue thoughtful and faithful? And so that's a lot. I thought when this first came in, I thought that'd be kind of maybe a quick thing, not so much. But just to recap, the question, is it just me or is the world getting more argumentative? Thoughts from a biblical perspective. There is a lot of rabid argumentation going on for a variety of reasons, perhaps because of nonstop news, information, how it is sometimes presented as combat. The advent of the internet, real-time interaction preys on our temptation to know what's going on and takes away the wisdom of sober second thought. Our society seems to be losing the ability to think deeply and actually respect difference without descending into polarization and name-calling. Sin has always been, continues to be, a very real part of our lives and world. Yet we are to remember who we are and who we are called to be, humble, loving, salt, and light, with God's help. We can disengage from the insanity. We remember that love is a decision, hostility is a reaction. As we think through this world in which we live, we think, how can my approach be thoughtful and loving?
Thanks for listening to the Pulse Podcast. I invite you to subscribe or maybe even leave a review on your favorite podcasting app. It helps spread the word. You can also sign up for the Up Daily Devotional that I write at theupdevo.com. Let's live abundantly, wholeheartedly.